Today at the House of Hacks, we're going to talk about not being discouraged as you're making progress, slow though it may be. Hi Makers, Builders, and Do-It-Yourselfers. I'm Harley, your host, and I'm joined today by my lovely wife, Diane. And we're going to be talking today on Maker Musings about discouragement and progress. I see online a lot of times people getting discouraged because they're not making the progress they kind of expect. They compare themselves to somebody else and they're way behind where they think that they should be. And I think that can be really discouraging, as I've seen online. And so I think it's really important to kind of play your own game and not try to play the game as somebody else plays it. Don't compare yourself to others. Another danger when comparing yourself to others is you may be much further ahead than them, and you might kind of slack off and not push yourself as hard as you might otherwise. And so there's kind of two dangers in comparing yourself. One, it leads to discouragement, which I kind of see more often, but the other can also lead to kind of self-aggrandizement and thinking more of yourself than you really should. So I recently ran into this concept of the long middle. I saw it on a blog article, I think on the Flern website, where they talked about the long middle being that place between when you first start a project and you're inspired by something new or a new idea, and you've got this big flush of energy and you start something, and then you hit the long middle, which is that point between where that first excitement wears off and before you get to the end, where you have the final stage of kind of a flurry of activity as you finish up the project. And that middle can sometimes kind of at least feel like it drags on for a long time.
Oh yes.
I know I've experienced that in a lot of projects. I know you have too. And so I kind of want to talk about that and how we can continue to make progress in that time period where we don't have necessarily the inspiration that we had at the start, and we don't have the rush of activity at the end yet.
Well, a lot of times my projects, for example, like quilting takes a long time. If you're making a large quilt, it's a long haul to get that quilt finished. And each process within making a quilt takes a long period of time. And I know that if I get discouraged with a quilt, I'll just put it down. And it's just time to walk away and say, I've got another day to work on it. So how do you deal with getting started on yet another day of the long middle?
So I think there's a couple things. First, I think it helps sometimes to just do warm-ups. So kind of like a musician does warm-ups before they present a piece, right? Just kind of limber up the fingers and get the brain working in music playing mode. Doing warm-ups for other activities can help too. If you're writing, before you sit down to work on your novel for the day, sit down and just do some morning journaling and stream of consciousness writing, right? It's just kind of the activity of getting words on paper kind of prepares the brain to do that later in the day. Another way would be if you're drawing or painting, just sit down with a scratch paper and do some doodling. Again, the idea is to get the brain in that mode that you're going to eventually use in the creation process.
See, I don't do warm-ups. I'm just the kind of person that I would prefer just to get started and jump right in. And often with sewing, I have found that that's not exactly the best thing to do, because often I will leave my sewing machine set up for the last project that I just finished, and then I'll start the next project without checking my settings on my sewing machine, and then just jump in and start sewing and end up having to take my first seam out completely and redo it, simply because I did not do the warm-up process of checking all my settings on my machine, making sure the thread was right, the needles were right, etc. And so warm-ups can be a good thing to do on a regular basis, even if you're really gung-ho to get started. Right. They can help prevent needless time-wasting efforts.
And that kind of reminds me of something that we talked several videos ago about in terms of having your space and resetting your space to cleaning up after yourself, if you will. Put everything back in its place. And it's kind of the same thing on your sewing machine. Put all your controls back into a known settings thing would be something else. But you're right, if you did warm-ups, the warm-up of doing that setup would kind of get you focused on the project at hand. Another thing that you can do is just make sure that you do something every day. I'm kind of reminded of the old fable, The Tortoise and the Hare, where the one went in spurts and got exhausted and ended up not making the race, and the other did a little bit consistently over time and made it to the goal. A real life example of that I recently read about was there were, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there were 2 exploration parties going to the South Pole. And they were led with kind of different philosophies. One of them, they made a little bit of progress every day. So if there was bad weather, they would make a little bit of progress. And if there was good weather, they'd make more progress. And the other team pushed themselves to exhaustion and made a lot of progress on days that were nice and had good weather. And days that had bad weather, they just stayed in their tents and didn't do anything. And the first team made it to the goal, I think it was 34 days ahead of schedule, and without any problems. The second team, everybody ended up dying because they got exhausted, and then they got discouraged on bad days, and it was literally fatal mistakes. And so I think if you just make a little bit of progress, even if it's not a huge amount, a little bit of progress every day, eventually you make it to your goal.
Which is why it's so important to not judge yourself based on what other people do, because you are unique and you are different.
Right.
And it's better to look at your progress, and because when you see your progress over time, you can tell that you actually have grown and you actually have gotten just a little bit closer to your goal. One of the things that I learned as a musician when I was taking lessons is I would tell my instructor, I am not getting anywhere with this. And she would literally take me back to something I had done a couple of months earlier and say, play this. And I would play it, and then she would say, you couldn't play that 6 months ago. Mm-hmm. And now you're playing it without any mistakes. Mm-hmm. And so she would take me back and show me that yes, I am making progress. It's just that the progress is so slow, I can't see it. Uh-huh. And I'm comparing myself to what somebody else is doing, some other progress that somebody else is making. Mm-hmm. And so that progress it's not a realistic thing for me to measure myself against, because I'm not that person.
Right. And you may be different places on their journey, mm-hmm. right? They may have been doing it for a lot longer than you, or to turn things around, you may be doing it longer than them.
So, discouragement is something that we all face, every single one of us. And the worst thing we can do is to compare ourselves to other people.
Right. Yep. And then the final thing I want to talk about today in terms of making progress is ignore mistakes in the moment of creation. So kind of decouple the creating from the fixing. Treat those as two separate tasks. Your brain kind of works a little bit differently when you're creating something new versus when you're going back and fixing things up. As an example, you have writers. So if you're writing, focus on getting words on paper or typing them into the computer. Don't worry about grammar, don't worry about spelling, just get the words down. And then treat editing as a separate task where you go back and you edit for grammar, you edit for content, you fix your spelling mistakes, those types of things. Because your brain is really working in two different modes when you're writing versus when you're editing. And if you try to do both at the same time, you won't do either of them well.
And understand that mistakes are a valuable tool. the worst thing we can do is to judge our mistakes and to use those mistakes as justification for putting ourselves down. Mistakes are a valuable tool. They're a tool that we have to say, oh, I'd better not do that. I better not put my finger on a hot stove. I'll burn myself. I've done that. Mom told me not to do it, and I went and I did it anyway. That wasn't a very good mistake to do, but I learned never to do that again.
I think we've all been there.
Yeah. So mistakes are a valuable tool for creating. And the worst thing we can do is to use a mistake and use that as justification for condemning ourselves.
Or stopping.
Or stopping, or quitting, or giving up. Exactly.
Yeah, ideally, a mistake should just be a learning experience to learn how to not do that in the future, or how to fix it once you have made the mistake. I remember my dad had told me growing up that the difference between a journeyman and an apprentice was the journeyman knew how to cover his mistakes.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing with musicians. Musicians make mistakes all the time. They just know how to cover them up.
Right.
Exactly. And same with painting. Painters artists make mistakes. They just know how to cover them up.
Right.
So it's not an issue of condemnation. It's an issue of the skill of being able to work with your medium.
Mm-hmm. And if you're comparing yourself to others, you don't realize the mistakes they're making because they're just covering them up well.
Exactly. And they are making mistakes, I promise you. I make mistakes in quilting. I just pulled a block apart because I sewed the sash to the wrong side of the block.
Yep. So thanks for joining us on your creative journey, wherever you happen to be on that journey. Until next time, go make something. Perfection's not required, fun is.